At 7:42 on the morning of March 14th, 1941, Beatrice Shilling stood on the tarmac at RAF Kenley, watching a Hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for what might be his last mission. She was 32 years old with 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and she had zero solutions to the problem that was killing British pilots. But in her leather satchel, she carried something that would either save the Royal Air Force or end her career. The Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the Channel that week. RAF pilots engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. 14 Hurricanes went down. 9 Spitfires. The pattern was always the same and brutally predictable. British pilot spots German fighter. British pilot pushes into a dive to attack. Engine cuts out. German fighter escapes, or worse, circles back and puts bullets through the stalled Hurricane while the pilot desperately fights to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Shilling had seen the combat reports, read the maintenance logs, and interviewed pilots who survived the failures. The carburetor flooded during negative G maneuvers. Simple physics with brutal consequences. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a sudden dive, fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The jet starved. The engine died for 1.5 seconds. That doesn't sound like much until you realize 1.5 seconds was enough time for a Messerschmitt to close 300 yards and open fire. The Germans didn't have this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection with no float chamber and no flooding. Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, and invert their aircraft without losing power for a single heartbeat. It gave them a decisive advantage in every engagement, and British pilots knew it. German pilots exploited it. Squadron commanders reported it. The Royal Air Force was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Shilling had spent 11 months working on the problem, but the engineering teams at Rolls-Royce were designing a pressure carburetor that wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 1944. The war wouldn't wait. The pilots couldn't wait. Every morning, young men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes knowing their own engines might kill them before the Germans got the chance. Squadron Leader Davies walked past Shilling toward the Hurricane that morning. He was 24 years old with 41 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills. He'd reported engine failure twice in the past month, both times during combat dives. Both times he survived by pure luck and thousands of hours of training. He nodded at Shilling. She nodded back. He didn't know she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. He probably thought she was someone's secretary. The solution had come to her in January through simple physics. The float chamber flooding happened because fuel could flow unrestricted when gravity reversed. What if you restricted the flow? Not completely, just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get fuel, just not too much. A brass disc with a precisely calculated hole in the center, installed in the fuel line before the carburetor to limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. She'd machined the first restrictor herself. The hole in the center was 0.04 inches. Those dimensions mattered critically. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve at full power. She tested 17 different sizes before finding the right one. Bench tests showed it worked perfectly, preventing flooding during simulated negative G conditions. But bench tests weren't combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour with negative G forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death in 1.5 seconds. The problem was getting permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated about 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Shilling would be court-martialed, maybe imprisoned. She decided to skip permission and ask forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, she had 6 restrictors in her satchel and one very cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years and seen 19 pilots die from engine failures. He didn't ask questions when Shilling showed him the brass washer. He just nodded and reached for his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad with the pilot inside, an engine warming up. 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked fast, disconnecting the fuel line between pump and carburetor. The restrictor slid into place. He welded it with a small butane torch in 60 seconds of work. The modification was invisible unless you knew where to look. Squadron Leader Davies would fly with the restrictor without knowing it was there. Shilling hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation. Just a dead pilot and a brass washer that shouldn't have been there. The Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies ran through pre-flight checks, released the brakes, and the Hurricane rolled forward, gathered speed, and lifted off. Shilling watched it climb through 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet. The Hurricane banked south toward the channel. She'd brought binoculars and watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet, where two more Hurricanes joined him in standard patrol formation. They flew toward Dungeness, where German fighters had been active all week. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he'd have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. Shilling waited on the tarmac with Cooper standing next to her. Neither of them spoke while ground crew prepared more Hurricanes and mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area. Normal sounds of a fighter station at war, but Shilling heard none of it. She was calculating fuel flow rates in her head, running through the math that worked on paper but might fail in combat. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from Davies' section, which could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters, or contact so intense there was no time to report, or Davies was dead and his Hurricane scattered across a French field. At 9:37, the radio crackled with the controller's voice announcing 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Shilling raised the binoculars and saw them. 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft. No losses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit and Davies landed first, taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, and climbed out. Shilling walked toward him with shaking hands. She'd designed bombs before and tested engine modifications under laboratory conditions, but she'd never done anything like this. Never installed an unauthorized modification and sent a pilot into combat to test it. Davies pulled off his helmet, and he was smiling. That was unusual. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. They usually looked exhausted and haunted. Davies looked excited. Cooper asked the question nobody else dared to voice. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Shilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlins ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." Shilling asked Davies to describe exactly what happened. He'd spotted 2 Messerschmitt 109s at 14,000 feet, both aircraft flying east toward France. Davies positioned his section above them for altitude advantage, then pushed into a steep dive at 400 miles per hour with negative G-forces strong enough to lift him against his harness straps. The dive that should have killed his engine, but the Merlin kept running at full power through the entire dive. Davies closed to 200 yards before the German pilot saw him, fired a 3-second burst, and saw strikes on the Messerschmitt's wing route. The German fighter broke hard right and fled toward France. Davies pulled up and climbed back to altitude. The engine performed flawlessly. It was the first time in 11 months that Davies successfully pressed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Shilling told him everything: the restrictor, the brass washer, the fuel flow limitation. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds, then turned to Cooper with a direct order. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station. Today." Shilling explained it wasn't authorized. Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kinley had lost friends to engine failures. 19 pilots dead in 6 months. Davies said if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed working engines. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 3 days with 0 engine failures and 12 diving attacks successfully pressed against German fighters. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly, with some claiming they were getting more power at altitude. Word spread fast through the RAF grapevine. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. They wanted it immediately. Shilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days asking if she could come to their stations, bring more restrictors, and how fast they could be manufactured. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal in 4 days, calling it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the production contract to manufacture 500 restrictors per week, with installation beginning immediately at every fighter station in Britain. The restrictor could be fitted without removing aircraft from service, which was critical because every Hurricane and Spitfire needed to stay operational. The Battle of Britain was technically over, but German fighters still crossed the Channel daily, and RAF Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons. By March 25th, installation teams were ready with 600 restrictors manufactured, 40 stations on the schedule, and 3,000 Merlin engines waiting for modification. Pilots started calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice, a nickname that came from Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce. It was crude British humor, slightly inappropriate, but Shilling didn't mind. She understood how military men dealt with stress, and if crude nicknames helped them remember the modification, she'd accept any name they wanted to use. The results were measurable and dramatic. Fighter Command tracked combat statistics meticulously. March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. April 1941, after the restrictor, engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%, almost non-existent. The kill-to-loss ratio improved immediately. March had been brutal, with 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires lost in combat versus 61 German aircraft shot down, a ratio of 1.3 to 1, barely breaking even. April was different. 29 British fighters lost versus 94 German aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 3.2 to 1. Squadron commanders credited the restrictor as a major contributor to this turnaround. German intelligence noticed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April mentioned improved RAF diving attacks. British fighters no longer broke off pursuit during negative G maneuvers. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had disappeared overnight, and German pilots found themselves suddenly vulnerable to aggressive British tactics they'd previously been immune to. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines across every Hurricane and Spitfire in Fighter Command, every operational training unit, and every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment, with new aircraft rolling off production lines coming with restrictors pre-installed. The pressure carburetor was still in development and estimated for production in 1943, but the restrictor worked so well that some engineers questioned whether the pressure carburetor was even necessary. Why redesign the entire fuel system when a 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? Shilling knew the answer. The restrictor was a brilliant stopgap, but temporary. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the negative G problem completely, with no fuel flow restrictions and no power limitations. That was the proper engineering solution. But until 1943, Miss Shilling's Orifice kept RAF pilots alive, and that was enough. The restrictor remained in service through 1943 and beyond. Many aircraft flew with it until 1944, some until the end of the war, because pilots trusted it and ground crews knew how to maintain it. Shilling moved on to other projects, working on cold weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia, researching high-altitude fuel mixture problems, and helping design improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. But the restrictor remained her most famous contribution. In 1948, King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, a total of 33 years of continuous service, and died on November 18, 1990, at age 81. Her legacy lives on in unexpected ways. A pub in Farnborough was renamed the Beatrice Shilling. Museums purchased her racing trophies. Universities opened buildings in her name. The restrictor itself became a teaching example in engineering schools worldwide. Simple solution to complex problem, immediate implementation under wartime pressure, measurable life-saving results. Everything good engineering should achieve. Small brass washers sit in museum cases today as reminders that elegant solutions don't require complexity, and sometimes a 50-cent piece of metal can change the course of a war.